Let's talk sin. This is something I happen to be fairly good at. I've been doing it for about 63, almost 64 years. We're going to be with you for about 5, possibly 6 lessons. First of all, let's talk about what exactly is sin. Well, it's a very popular word in the Bible. The King James Version uses the word sin 448 times. The first time sin is used is in Genesis chapter 4, verse number 7. And there we read these words out of the NIV. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. The last time sin is used in the Bible is in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. In the Hebrew, the word sin, it means offense. In the Greek, it means offense, but it also has this idea of missing the mark. Sin is an offense against God. Sin is an offense against God's laws. It is an offense against God's wishes. It's an offense against God's demands. It's an offense against God's desires. I want to share with you 6 things about sin. Here's the first thing I want to tell you about sin. Number 1, in God's economy, sin, regardless of its size, is very, very significant. And so don't think in terms of little sins or big sins. In God's economy, regardless of the size, sin is significant. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20 says this: "The one who sins is the one who will die." And in God's economy, sin is very, very significant. Here's the second thing I want to share with you. All sin is ultimately an offense against God. All sin ultimately is an offense against God. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13, this is speaking of God. "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing." And in God's economy and the way that God looks at things, all sin is an offense against him. And that's because God is God, I'm not, you're not, because it's God's world, it's God's air that we're breathing. Everything is God's business. So, secondly, all sin ultimately is an offense against God. Number 3, all sin must be paid for. There is no sin that's excusable. So there is no sin that can be looked upon as kind of, just a little bit of mistake. There is no little sin. There's no passing grade. You know, when you went to school and you filled out an exam, you hope to get a passing grade. But when it comes to sin, there is only one passing grade. That is perfection. It's black or white. It's right or wrong. There's no gray. There's no in between with God. So Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 5, 25 and 26. "Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Verse number 26 of Matthew 5. Truly I say to you, you'll not get out of prison until you have paid the last penny. All sin must be paid for. No sin is excusable. Number 4, the payment price for sin can only be defined by the one offended. Okay, read it again. The payment price for sin can only be defined by the one offended. Matthew chapter 5, 41 to 46. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you didn't invite me in. I needed clothes, you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't look after me. And so they said, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison, and we didn't help you out? And God said clearly, listen clearly, he will reply, truly I tell you, whoever did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me. Then they will go away into eternal punishment. If you borrow $200 from me, you can't define the repayment. You can't say to me, well, Peter, I'm going to give you $5 every 3 years, right? No, if you borrow $200 from me, I need to define to you the terms of repayment. Or I may forgive the debt totally, but you can't do that. Only I can do it because you borrowed the money from me. In God's economy, remember, we sin against God. And we believe that the scriptures teach us this. The payment price for the sin can only be defined by the one who's offended. Number 5. Human beings, humankind, left to themselves, are sinners by birth and sinners by choice. I always tell you this. I always tell this story. The first day of school, when I took my boys to school, I didn't have this speech with them. Now, boys, when you get to school, you're going to find out that there's people that are liars. So let me describe what lying is to you so you'll understand when you hear a lie. No. Left to themselves, my boys were perfect liars. I didn't have to teach them to lie. I didn't have to teach them to cheat. You don't teach people how to sin. They sin naturally because we are born sinners and we're sinners by choice. Number 6, and this is incredibly significant. Sin leads to pain, judgment, and ultimately death. Sin will always lead to pain, bondage, judgment, and ultimately to death. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 16. The wages of the righteous is life, but the earnings of the wicked are death and sin. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world, and the rulers of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. So here's the 6 things Number one, in God's economy, regardless of the size of sin, it is significant. Number two, all sin ultimately is an offense against God. Number three, all sin must be paid for. No sin is excusable. Number four, the payment for sin can only be defined by the one offended, by God. Number five, humankind, left to themselves, are sinners by choice, sinners by birth. Number six, sin will always lead to pain, bondage, and ultimately to death.